October 25, 1944. The waters off Samar Island churned beneath the thunder of artillery and the scream of aircraft engines. Dawn light spilled over the Pacific, not as a gentle glow, but as a sinister stage lamp, illuminating a clash that should never have happened. On one side, the proud remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Kongo, iron behemoths built for decisive victory. On the other, a ragged group of American escort carriers, flimsy jeep carriers that sailors nicknamed Kaiser coffins. They were slow, thin-skinned, barely armored, and armed with little more than anti-aircraft guns. In Tokyo war councils, admirals had laughed at them, calling them training toys unworthy of mention in naval strategy. Yet on this morning, steel and smoke conspired to turn ridicule into horror. The sea itself seemed to quake as Yamato's 18.1-inch guns opened fire. Shells the size of small cars arced across the horizon, slamming into the ocean with geysers that dwarfed the American ships. Crews aboard the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay watched walls of water rise higher than their flight deck, each impact a reminder of how close death hovered. These men had no business being here. They were meant for convoy duty, shuttling aircraft and supplies across safer waters. Now they faced the concentrated firepower of Japan's most powerful warships, an entire surface fleet hunting down ships designed to run, not fight. The Japanese commanders had expected annihilation within minutes. Their scouts reported a dozen small carriers, which they mistook for fleet carriers, an illusion that spurred them into pursuit. The order was given: destroy the American task group and cut the invasion fleet at Leyte to pieces. The Japanese laughed in their flagships, picturing the carrier's decks smashed apart, planes burning uselessly on the sea. It would be a morning hunt, nothing more. Victory, they thought, had fallen into their lap. They did not know that mockery would soon curdle into disbelief. As the first salvos landed, the Americans responded not with retreat, but with desperation that looked like madness. Pilots scrambled from decks too small for comfort, engines roaring as wildcats and Avengers clawed into the sky. Many launched without full fuel, without proper armament, and some even without bombs, armed only with machine guns or depth charges meant for submarines. It didn't matter. They flew anyway. From above, the Japanese fleet appeared vast and unstoppable. But to the men of Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit, it was a wall of fire they had no choice but to breach. Destroyers charged forward like rabid hounds, their slim hulls slicing through swells as they laid smoke screens to shield the carriers. USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, turned broadside and unleashed torpedoes at cruisers many times her size. Shells raked her decks, tearing metal and flesh alike, yet Evans pressed on. A fighting ship, he had promised his crew when he took command, will never retreat. Now his words became prophecy. Johnston lunged again and again, her guns barking until they glowed red, her torpedo racks empty, her bridge shattered. Still she fought. One destroyer against a fleet. From the decks of the carriers, sailors stared at the monstrous silhouettes of Yamato and Kongo looming through the mist. These were giants, gods of war that no escort carrier was meant to face. Every hit that missed was a miracle. Every second alive felt stolen. Yet instead of panic, resolve hardened. They launched again and again, pilots circling back with nothing but strafing runs, peppering superstructures, harassing gun crews, anything to slow the Leviathans. Even depth charges, meant for subs lurking beneath the waves, were rolled from aircraft bays onto the armored decks of Japanese cruisers. It was warfare turned improvised, desperate, and defiant. The Japanese officers peering through binoculars began to waver. Reports crackled across their radios. Torpedo hits on Kumano, fire aboard Chikuma, shells biting into heavy cruisers that were supposed to sweep the sea clean. Their prey did not scatter like sheep. Instead, it bit back like a cornered wolf. Confusion spread as smoke concealed targets. Aircraft darted through clouds, and destroyers carved chaos into their formation. Admiral Kurita, commanding from Yamato, had expected slaughter. What he faced was resistance so fierce, so unrelenting, that doubt crept into his command. The sea battle unfolded like a fever dream. Gambier Bay shuddered as shells finally found her. Fire licked across her decks, her engines died, and she slipped beneath the waves, the only American carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire in the war. Yet even as she fell, her sacrifice bought time. The Japanese pressed harder, convinced victory was within reach, but every mile forward cost them blood, steel, and time they could not afford. By mid-morning, their ammunition ran low, their ships battered not by superior firepower, but by audacity. And then, like smoke fading into the wind, the Japanese momentum faltered. Kurita hesitated. His fleet had mauled the Americans, but not destroyed them. Reports of airstrikes from other directions sowed doubt, phantoms of non-existent carrier groups, conjured by the relentless harassment of Taffy 3's aviators. To press forward was to risk annihilation from the air. To retreat was unthinkable for an admiral of the Emperor's Navy. Yet, staring at the carnage inflicted by a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, Kurita's confidence crumbled. Against ships he had mocked as toys, he turned his fleet away. By noon, the impossible had happened. A handful of jeep carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts had stood against the might of Japan's most powerful battleships and forced them to withdraw. Mockery had transformed into humiliation, and humiliation into one of the greatest blunders of the Pacific War. Yamato, Queen of the Seas, turned her bow homeward, not in triumph, but in retreat, leaving behind wreckage, smoke, and disbelief. For the men of Taffy 3, bloodied but unbroken. History had been rewritten on the waves of Samar. The story spread quickly, carried in whispers among surviving sailors, and later in dispatches that stunned Washington. What had been dismissed as cannon fodder had become the unlikely savior of the Philippine landings. Escort carriers, derided as weak and expendable, had humbled the giants of the Imperial Navy. Japanese admirals who once laughed at their existence now faced the bitter truth. The future of naval warfare belonged not to battleships, but to the very ships they had scorned. The tide of the Pacific had shifted, not by brute force, but by ingenuity, courage, and the will to fight against the impossible. By late 1944, the Pacific was a battlefield of extremes. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had thundered across the seas with an aura of invincibility, seizing vast territories from Malaya to the Philippines and projecting power deep into the Pacific. Yet beneath that aura, cracks had begun to show. The tide had turned at Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese carriers were lost in a single day, a blow from which Japan never fully recovered. The Solomon Islands campaign bled them further, Guadalcanal turning into a graveyard of ships and men. By 1944, American industrial might was overwhelming, flooding the Pacific with carriers, submarines, and aircraft in numbers that dwarfed Japan's shrinking arsenal. But the Imperial Navy was not yet finished. Its admirals still dreamed of one last decisive battle, a single clash that could cripple the American advance and perhaps force Washington to negotiate. This was the doctrine of Kamikaze, the decisive fleet action. For decades, Japan's naval strategists had worshipped this idea, a titanic engagement, battleship against battleship, where superior skill and courage would outweigh the enemy's industry. It was a vision steeped in the legacy of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese fleet had annihilated the Russians and stunned the world. They longed to repeat it. The opportunity seemed to come in October 1944, when American forces under General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines. The Japanese High Command launched Shogo 1, Operation Victory. It was a desperate, sprawling plan that threw nearly every remaining ship into the fray. Carriers, stripped of most of their aircraft, were used as decoys to lure the powerful U.S. Third Fleet north. Meanwhile, the center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would surge through the central Philippines, smash the vulnerable landing zones at Leyte Gulf, and drive the Americans back into the sea. It was a gamble on a scale few in history had dared to attempt to execute it. Kurita's force boasted some of the most fearsome warships ever built. The Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, each displacing more than 70,000 tons, carried the largest naval guns ever mounted, 18.1 inches in diameter, capable of hurling shells nearly 25 miles. Alongside them sailed battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, veterans of earlier campaigns. Heavy cruisers like Chokai, Suzuya, and Shikuma added speed and firepower, while destroyers screened the formation like a wall of blades. On paper, this was overwhelming strength, an armada meant to erase any opposition. Against this juggernaut, the Americans had divided their fleets. Admiral William Halsey's fast carriers chased the Japanese decoys to the north, leaving only the small escort carriers of Taffy 3, Taffy 2, and Taffy 1 to protect the invasion beaches. These were not fleet carriers with armored decks and strike groups of 100 planes. They were escort carriers, built cheaply on merchant hulls, designed to ferry aircraft and provide limited air support. Slower than destroyers and vulnerable to a single battleship salvo, they were never meant to face a surface fleet. Sailors aboard often joked they were 2 torpedo hits away from being a reef. The men knew their place: support, not spearhead. Yet fate, indifferent to design or doctrine, positioned them in the path of Kurita's center force. When Musashi had been sunk by waves of American carrier planes in the sea beyond sea the day before, Kurita pressed on, still confident his force could smash the invasion fleet. He believed he would find troop transports and helpless supply ships at Leyte Gulf. Instead, at dawn off Samar, he stumbled upon something else: 6 escort carriers and their tiny screen of destroyers. To Kurita's mind, these were no obstacle. Mockery filled the wardrooms of his heavy cruisers. These were the prey they had waited for. American commanders knew the truth. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, leading Taffy 3, looked through his binoculars at the black columns of smoke rising from Japanese funnels and recognized disaster. His carriers could not outrun the battleships. They could not withstand their shells. His escorts were outgunned 10-1. On any normal day, doctrine demanded retreat. But this was not a normal day. Behind Taffy 3 lay the invasion fleet. Hundreds of transports, soldiers, and supplies, the lifeblood of MacArthur's return. If Kurita broke through, the landings at Leyte could collapse. The entire Philippine campaign hung on these fragile ships. It was the clash of 2 visions of war. For the Japanese, this was their chance to fulfill Kantai Kessen, the long-awaited decisive battle. For the Americans, it was survival against impossible odds. And woven between them was irony, so sharp it cut like steel. The very carriers Kurita dismissed as worthless would become the fulcrum on which his gamble unraveled. Context is everything. Japan's faith in battleships as the heart of naval power blinded its admirals to the revolution already underway. At Midway and in the Solomons, aircraft carriers had proved their dominance, projecting power far beyond gun range. Yet old habits and pride died slowly. The Yamato had been built as the ultimate answer to America's fleet, a floating fortress bristling with armor and guns. By 1944, she was already a relic, a weapon forged for a past era. Escort carriers, in contrast, were the product of America's adaptability: cheap, plentiful, and expendable. They were not glamorous, but they filled the seas in numbers the Japanese could never match. Quantity, not elegance, was rewriting the rules. The Japanese mocked them as cheap tin cans. Their flight decks were barely 500 feet long, their elevators slow, and their hangars cramped. Aircraft launched with the help of strong winds, and recovery was perilous in rough seas. Yet each one could carry 30 planes, and in the aggregate, they provided a web of air support across the Pacific. What the Japanese failed to grasp was that war had shifted from duels of dreadnoughts to networks of interlinked units. An escort carrier was weak alone, but in the hands of determined crews and supported by destroyers, it could become a thorn that pierced even the mightiest leviathans. That October, history demanded that both sides prove the value of their doctrines in blood. The Imperial Navy sailed to fulfill its dream of decisive battle. The Americans braced to defend with ships never meant to stand in the line of fire. The laughter of Japanese admirals echoed faintly across the seas, a confidence rooted in the past. Soon, that laughter would dissolve into stunned silence, as the underestimated jeep carriers and their companions showed the world that mockery had no place on a battlefield where courage and improvisation mattered more than steel. What the Japanese admirals could not see through their binoculars that morning was not steel, but resolve. The hidden edge of the American escort carriers was never in their armor, thin as a soda can, or in their guns, pitiful beside the thunder of Yamato's batteries. Their advantage lay in something invisible yet decisive: the will to fight with every tool at hand and the ability to knit fragile ships, obsolete destroyers, and underarmed aircraft into a single, coordinated, living organism. It was this fusion, audacity and improvisation, that turned weakness into strength and transformed scorned jeep carriers into instruments of humiliation for the Imperial Navy. The Japanese had mocked them for years. Escort carriers were merchant hulls with flight decks bolted on, built in American shipyards with dizzying speed. They lacked the speed of fleet carriers, the firepower of cruisers, and the armor of battleships. To Japanese strategists raised on Kamikaze, they were clutter, auxiliaries for second-rate tasks. They believed war was decided by shock and thunder, by great ships smashing each other until one side broke. In that world, a ship like USS Gamber Bay or USS White Plains was beneath contempt. But war is rarely what doctrine imagines. The hidden advantage of the escort carriers was adaptability. Where Japan clung to tradition, the United States improvised. These carriers carried aircraft that could pivot from ground support to anti-ship attacks in an instant. Their crews were trained not for glory, but for persistence, flying sorties from dawn to dusk, ferrying supplies, and supporting invasions. They were workhorses, and in their unglamorous repetition lay a discipline the Japanese never anticipated. When Kurita's fleet erupted over the horizon, those toys did not scatter. They fought back in the only ways they could: piecemeal, desperate, improvisational. And it was enough to shake giants. The greatest hidden edge was the aircraft themselves. Grumman FM, 2 Wildcats, and TBM Avengers were not cutting edge by 1944. The Wildcat was stubby, slow, and outclassed by the faster Japanese Zero. The Avenger was built as a torpedo bomber, not a ship killer. But in the hands of determined pilots, they became weapons of chaos. Wildcats swarmed low, peppering cruiser decks with machine gun fire, forcing anti-aircraft crews to duck and breaking the rhythm of Japanese barges. Avengers dove in with torpedoes, bombs, and even depth charges when nothing else remained. Pilots knew they lacked proper armament, but they launched anyway. Some made dry runs with no ordnance at all, feinting attacks that forced enemy ships to maneuver, scattering their formations and sowing doubt. From Kurita's flagship Yamato, this resistance was bewildering. Reports flowed in: heavy cruisers damaged by torpedoes, destroyers struck by bombs, and formations disrupted by smoke and harassment. To the Japanese officers, it felt like an ambush from a far larger fleet. They could not comprehend that such punishment came from the very ships they had ridiculed. They assumed powerful fleet carriers lurked beyond the smoke, hidden reinforcements that would strike at any moment. In truth, there were none, only Taffy 3, clawing survival from improvisation. Another hidden advantage was psychological. For the Americans, these escort carriers represented survival not only for themselves, but also for the invasion behind them. Every man aboard knew that if they broke, the beaches of Leyte would run red. The knowledge forged a kind of desperation that looked to the enemy like confidence. Crews launched into the sky half-armed. Destroyers charged headlong at cruisers 3 times their size, and men fought with a ferocity born of necessity. The Japanese mistook it for overstrength, believing they faced a larger, more formidable enemy than reality. Deception was unintentional but devastating. Communication sealed the advantage. American radios were clear, reliable, and plentiful, a quiet revolution compared to the often fragile systems aboard Japanese ships. Escort carriers, destroyers, and aircraft wove themselves into a single nervous system. Smoke screens were laid in sync with aircraft strikes. Torpedo runs aligned with carrier launches. Even in chaos, they moved with cohesion. To the Japanese, it seemed uncanny. How could such flimsy ships strike so effectively, retreat so nimbly, and cover each other so seamlessly? The answer was not better ships, but better integration. The Americans fought as one organism. The Japanese fought as fragments of doctrine, colliding in the fog of war. The hidden advantage also lay in the destroyers, the so-called tin cans. USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Herman were afterthoughts in the fleet, meant to screen carriers from submarines, not duel with battleships. Yet on that morning, they charged through curtains off waterspouts, torpedoes slashing toward cruisers, guns blazing until their barrels glowed. The courage of men like Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston became force multipliers. Each torpedo spread sent Japanese captains scrambling, forcing mighty warships to turn, break formation, and lose their killing rhythm. A single destroyer could not sink a battleship outright, but it could disrupt an entire battle line. That disruption was enough to save the carriers. Kurita's fleet was unraveling not from superior firepower, but from the persistence of an enemy that refused to die. Escort carriers launched until their decks ran empty. Pilots landed on half-sinking ships, rearmed, and clawed back into the sky. Destroyers limped with their decks aflame, yet fired again until they rolled over and sank. The Japanese saw a fleet that fought like it was backed by reserves, like it had strength to burn. They did not realize they were witnessing desperation distilled into brilliance. Mockery had blinded them. They thought escort carriers were beneath consideration, yet here they were, holding the line against the pride of the Imperial Navy. They thought American destroyers would never charge into certain death, yet here they came, guns blazing into the maw of cruisers. They thought American pilots would not dare launch half-armed, yet here they were, dropping depth charges on battleships like hornets stinging elephants. What the Japanese could not see was that in war, humiliation often comes not from what you underestimate, but from what you never imagined possible. The hidden advantage was not hardware. It was the convergence of will, communication, improvisation, and sheer audacity. Escort carriers were mocked as fragile boxes on the sea, but when fused with the determination of their crews, they became something greater than the sum of their parts. Against a fleet built on pride and tradition, they embodied the adaptability of a nation that turned factories into arsenals and improvisation into doctrine. By the end of the morning, Kurita's battleships had failed to crush the escort carriers. He saw smoke, he saw chaos, he saw his cruisers battered, and he saw his destroyers scrambling. He imagined powerful fleet carriers lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to finish the job. In truth, all he faced were the very ships he had once dismissed with laughter. And in that bitter irony lay the greatest hidden advantage of all, being underestimated. The secret of the escort carriers was not glamour, but engineering stripped to its essentials. They were born not in grand naval yards, but on the assembly lines of American industry, where efficiency and numbers outweighed perfection. Each one was a compromise, smaller, slower, and weaker than the fleet carriers that dominated headlines. Yet it was precisely these compromises that made them indispensable and, in moments like Samar, unexpectedly lethal. To understand how these so-called jeep carriers humiliated the battleships of the rising sun, one must descend into the details of their design, their aircraft, and the furious ingenuity of the men who operated them. The Casablanca class, the most numerous of the escort carriers, embodied the concept. Stretching just 512 feet in length and displacing 10,400 tons, they were half the size of the great Essex-class fleet carriers. Their top speed, 19 knots, was a plodding crawl compared to the 30-knot dash of their larger cousins. Their flight decks could handle only 27 to 30 aircraft, barely a third of a fleet carrier's complement. Armor was almost non-existent. A single well-placed shell could rip them open from bow to stern. Yet what they lacked in power, they made up for in presence. Over 50 Casablanca-class carriers were launched between 1943 and 1944, an industrial miracle, rolling off production lines at an average of one ship every 2 weeks. They were not meant to duel. They were meant to be everywhere. The Japanese laughed at this philosophy. To them, warships were sacred instruments of the emperor's will, crafted with painstaking detail and pride. A Yamato took years to build, each rivet and plate fitted like a masterpiece. The idea of producing carriers like automobiles was alien to their naval culture. Yet America's Industrial Revolution was its own weapon. By war's end, the United States had launched over 120 escort carriers, far more than Japan could have dreamed of matching. Individually fragile, collectively they were a swarm, a tide of steel too vast to be checked. Technically, the escort carriers were bare bones. Their catapults were hydraulic, slower, and weaker than the steam catapults of later decades. Their arresting gear struggled with heavier aircraft, limiting them to compact planes like the FM-2 Wildcat and TBM Avenger. Their defensive armament consisted of 5-inch dual-purpose guns at the stern, backed by 40 and 20 anti-aircraft cannons. Against kamikazes and bombers, these weapons provided a thin umbrella of fire. Against battleships, they were laughable. No escort carrier could outgun a destroyer, let alone the 18.1-inch rifles of Yamato. Yet these limitations forced crews to lean on their aircraft, turning every sortie into both sword and shield. The FM-2 Wildcat, the carrier's standard fighter, was already obsolete by 1944. With a top speed of just over 320 miles per hour, it was slower and less agile than the Zero, a plane it had first faced in 1942. But by Samar, it was lighter, rugged, and capable of clawing into the air from the short decks of the Jeep carriers. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, it could strafe destroyer decks and tear apart vulnerable gunnery crews. Its true advantage lay not in killing power, but in persistence. It could be launched quickly, land easily, and return again and again, harrying the enemy until frustration outweighed confidence. The TBM Avenger was the workhorse. Designed as a torpedo bomber, it carried payloads of up to 2,000 pounds, torpedoes, bombs, depth charges, or improvised combinations when supplies ran thin. At Samar, many Avengers launched without torpedoes at all, loaded instead with 100-pound bombs or even depth charges intended for submarines. On paper, such armament was pitiful against a battleship. Yet the Avenger's endurance, over 1,000 miles, meant it could circle, harass, and return for repeated passes, a mosquito buzzing endlessly at an enemy elephant. Each attack forced Japanese ships to maneuver, wasting time, scattering formations, and leaving them vulnerable to the torpedoes of American destroyers. Numbers tell part of the story. At Samar, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 could muster barely 70 aircraft in total. By contrast, the Japanese center force brought 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. On any chart, the odds were absurd. Yamato alone displaced 7 times the weight of an entire escort carrier. Its 18.1-inch shells could punch through armor plates 26 inches thick, armor that Jeep carriers simply did not possess. One direct hit meant annihilation. Yet technology is not only about strength. It is about application. The American aircraft, though inferior individually, operated as extensions of the carriers, darting into the fight like shards of a shattered blade, cutting in unexpected ways. Factories gave them this chance. The escort carriers were mass-produced at Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, where Henry J. Kaiser applied the same methods that had built Liberty ships. Prefabricated sections rolled down rails, welded rather than riveted, slashed construction time to months instead of years. While Japan poured resources into a handful of Leviathans, America flooded the seas with these small decks. The Japanese mocked the carriers as cheap toys, but it was precisely their cheapness that made them dangerous. For every carrier lost, another 2 would soon sail. Against Yamato's grandeur, the Americans fielded inevitability. Even the destroyers had their technical secrets. The Fletcher-class destroyers screening the escort carriers carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 5-inch guns, and depth charges. They displaced just 2,100 tons, fragile before battleships, but their engines pushed them past 35 knots. At Samar, this speed became a dagger. Charging into the face-off cruisers and launching spreads of torpedoes, they forced ships like Chokai and Kumano to turn hard, spoiling their gunnery and creating openings. The destroyers were nicknamed tin cans by their own sailors, but their torpedoes could rip open hulls meant to withstand shells. In sheer bravery, their thin armor became irrelevant. Communications technology sealed the system together. The Americans relied on VH radios, which were robust, clear, and resistant to interference. Orders flowed swiftly, destroyers laying smoke in sync with air attacks, carriers adjusting flight schedule mid-battle, and pilots coordinating feints and dives. The Japanese, by contrast, struggled with less reliable sets. Messages often lagged or were garbled in the chaos. Kurita commanded a mighty fleet, but it moved like a colossus chained to tradition. Sprague's Taffy 3, weak in tonnage, fought like a single, flexible mind, The technical deep dive reveals the paradox. Escort carriers and their aircraft were not superior in isolation. They were weaker, slower, and less survivable than almost anything the Japanese fielded. But as a system, they excelled. Their weakness forced integration. Their limits demanded improvisation. When Yamato's crew stared across the waves at ships they had mocked, they did not see the invisible web connecting carrier, plane, and destroyer. They saw only tin boxes daring to resist, and they mistook that defiance for hidden strength lurking just beyond sight. The truth was stranger. There was no hidden fleet, no armored giants waiting in reserve. There were only cheap ships, workhorse planes, and the ingenuity of crews who refused to yield. In the cold mathematics of war, those numbers should not have balanced. Yet through industry, communication, and courage, they tipped the scales. And in that technical reality lies the greatest irony of Samar. The most advanced battleships in history were humbled not by equals, but by ships designed as expendables. The morning of October 25, 1944, was meant to be a procession of slaughter. When the Imperial Japanese Navy Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita emerged from the mists off Samar, it carried the weight of empire upon its decks. For battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers steamed in tight formation. The pride of the rising sun had returned to the battlefield, their guns ready to sweep aside anything foolish enough to stand in their path. Opposite them, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3, looked like a child's toy set abandoned on a sea too vast for its scale. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers. For destroyer escorts. In tonnage, in firepower, in speed, the mismatch was absurd. Yet what followed was not slaughter. It was defiance carved into history, a tale of tin cans, smoke, and courage that would echo long after the guns fell silent. AT-0645 hours. Lookouts aboard USS Fanshawe Bay sighted black columns of smoke rising from the western horizon. Within minutes, massive silhouettes emerged, cruisers first, then the looming towers of battleships. The alarm spread like fire through Sprague's formation. His carriers had just launched their morning strikes to support MacArthur's landings at Leyte. Most of their aircraft were in the air, low on fuel and armed with bombs meant for ground targets, not armor plate. On deck, only a handful remained ready. Taffy 3 had stumbled into the jaws of a fleet designed for decisive battle. Sprague reacted instantly. He ordered his carriers eastward, racing for rain squalls that might conceal them. His destroyers and escorts fell back to lay smoke screens, walls of white drifting across the sea to hide the carrier's retreat. Radios crackled, pilots were recalled, and new orders screamed into headsets. Rearm for anti-ship strikes if possible, attack immediately if not. Improvisation became doctrine in a heartbeat. The escort carriers began to launch whatever planes they could. Wildcats clawed into the sky half-fueled, and Avengers soared off decks with bombs still strapped for ground targets, some with nothing more lethal than depth charges. Yet they went, because the alternative was annihilation. To AT-0700, Yamato opened fire. Her 18.1-inch rifles thundered, shells arcing 20 miles toward the retreating American formation. Great geysers erupted among the carriers, columns of seawater towering higher than their decks. USS White Plains shuddered as a near miss slammed her hull, shockwaves buckling plates and sending men sprawling. To those aboard, it felt as though the ocean itself had risen against them. The Japanese expected panic. Instead, they found defiance. Sprague's ships weaved, turned, vanished behind smoke, and reappeared to launch again, all while under the gaze of giants. AT-0720. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston made his fateful choice. He did not wait for orders. Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, displaced barely 2,100 tons. Against the 30,000-ton heavy cruisers closing in, it was suicide to engage. Evans chose it anyway. Commenced firing. His 5-inch guns roared, shells slamming into Kumano, the lead cruiser. Then, at 7,000 yards, Johnston loosed 10 torpedoes in a spread that forced the Japanese ship to turn violently, shattering their formation. Shells crashed into Johnston in reply, smashing her superstructure and disabling her engines, but Evans drove on. Even crippled, Johnston circled back, firing until her guns ran dry. Hull and Heermann joined the charge, racing from the screen like wolves at the throat of giants. Torpedoes fanned across the sea, striking Chikuma and Chokai, crippling both. Japanese formations, once precise, dissolved into chaos as ships turned wildly to avoid spreads, exposing themselves to further attack. The destroyers were dying, but they were buying time with every run. Overhead, the sky turned into a swarm. Wildcats dove low, strafing the decks of cruisers, killing exposed gunners. Avengers screamed down with bombs, some too light to pierce armor, yet enough to rip holes in destroyer decks and start fires. Pilots without ordnance made mock attacks, swooping in to force ships to zigzag, scattering their aim. A handful even dropped depth charges on battleship decks, makeshift strikes that did little physical damage but hammered morale. Every minute of harassment frayed Kurita's confidence. He had expected helpless prey. What he faced was a wasp's nest, each sting minor, but together maddening. A BY-0830. The Japanese had closed within 17,000 yards. Gambier Bay, trailing the formation, became the first victim. Shells from heavy cruisers raked her decks, tearing gaping wounds in her thin hull. Fire spread, her engines failed, and by 0900 she rolled and sank. The only American carrier ever destroyed by surface gunfire in the war. Yet, even in death, Gambier Bay bought another hour for her sisters. The destroyer Escort USS Samuel B. Roberts fought like a ship possessed. Charging through walls of water, she closed to within 4,000 yards of heavy cruisers, her 5-inch guns firing so rapidly that the barrels glowed white-hot. For 35 minutes, she dueled ships 10 times her size, scoring dozens of hits before being reduced to a wreck. Her crew called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, a title earned in fire and blood. By mid-morning, the Japanese center force was bleeding. Heavy cruisers Chokai and Suzuya were crippled. Chikuma lay dead in the water, later finished by aircraft. Kurita himself had narrowly avoided torpedo strikes. His ships were still powerful, still more than capable of annihilating the escort carriers. Yet something unseen gnawed at him. Reports of relentless air attacks made him fear reinforcements. Every plane that dove from the clouds seemed to confirm his suspicion. Surely this was only the screen of a larger American fleet lurking just out of sight. He did not realize that what he faced was all there was. No fleet carriers, no battleships, just 6 fragile escort carriers and their escorts fighting for survival. T-0930. Kurita hesitated. His ships had failed to overrun the Americans. Smoke, torpedoes, and constant air attacks had slowed his advance to a crawl. Ammunition stores dwindled, and fuel was not limitless. Most of all, his certainty cracked. Reports came of other American carrier groups nearby, though these were phantoms conjured by desperation. He had inflicted losses. Gambier Bay sunk, destroyers shattered, but the invasion fleet at Leyte remained untouched. To press further risked his entire force. To retreat preserved it, but at the cost of Japan's grand gambled T-0945. Kurita gave the order. His fleet turned northward, breaking contact. Yamato's great guns fell silent, their promise of decisive victory collapsing into empty thunder. The Americans, bloodied and battered, watched in disbelief as the Leviathans receded into the horizon. Against every law of naval power, against every chart of tonnage and firepower, the mockery of escort carriers had transformed into triumph. When the smoke cleared, Taffy 3 had paid dearly. 1 carrier, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort lost, with thousands dead or wounded. But Kurita's retreat ensured the safety of the Leyte landings. The decisive battle Japan had sought had become a decisive humiliation. The escort carriers, scorned as expendable, had stood in the line of fire and survived. The battle off Samar became legend not because of numbers, but because of audacity. Gambier Bay's wreck lay beneath the waves, but her story rose higher than Yamato's thunder. Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts lay broken, but their charges etched themselves into naval history as acts of defiance unmatched in scale. A force dismissed as weak had met a fleet built on pride, and in that clash, the balance of the Pacific tilted forever when the smoke of Samar drifted into the vast Pacific sky. What lingered was not only the wreckage of ships, but also a wound carved deep into the minds of both navies. Strategy is measured not just in ships lost or waters held, but in the ripples of fear, confidence, and morale that surge far beyond a battlefield. The clash between escort carriers and the mighty center force revealed truths that textbooks could not capture. It was not a duel of equals. It was humiliation for one side and exaltation for the other. And the psychological impact would haunt the Imperial Japanese Navy long after their shells stopped falling. For the Japanese, Samar was supposed to be vindication. For decades, they had preached Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet action. Yamato and Musashi were the crown jewels of that doctrine, embodiments of steel and pride. Kurita had marched into Samar certain that he would annihilate weak American auxiliaries. Yet what should have been easy slaughter unraveled into chaos. Instead of shattering morale, Kurita's fleet found itself paralyzed by relentless strikes from jeep carriers and desperate charges from tin cans. In Tokyo, when reports filtered back, admirals who had once scoffed at these ships fell silent. They had mocked America's reliance on mass-produced carriers, yet now entire fleets were turned back by them. The laughter that once echoed in strategy rooms was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing dread. The psychological blow to Kurita himself was immense. He had commanded some of the most powerful ships ever constructed, and yet he retreated from vessels designed for convoy duty. On paper, he still possessed overwhelming strength when he turned away. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought in the fog of uncertainty, where perception becomes as lethal as firepower. Each torpedo spread from destroyers, each desperate bombing run from Avengers, fed Kurita's belief that a larger American force lurked beyond sight. His decision to retreat preserved his ships, but broke the illusion of Japanese naval supremacy. He had not been defeated by mightier vessels, but by ships his own navy had derided as weak. Pride cracked, and with it the spirit of the fleet. For the Americans, the impact was the reverse. Taffy 3's survival was nothing short of miraculous, and miracles inspire legends. Word spread quickly across the Pacific. A handful of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts had stood against the Yamato herself and lived. Crews who had expected to die found themselves victors. The Navy trumpeted the story, hailing the courage of Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts as proof that American sailors could overcome impossible odds. For men on other escort carriers across the Pacific, this was fuel. No longer were they Kaiser coffins or cheap tin cans. They were ships of legend, guardians of invasion fleets, capable of turning humiliation upon the enemy. The strategic consequences were profound. By retreating, Kurita abandoned the last true opportunity Japan had to disrupt the Leyte landings. The American beachhead remained intact, supplies flowed freely, and MacArthur's army pushed deeper into the Philippines. Without Samar, Leyte might have been bled in fire. With Samar, the invasion became irreversible. Within months, the Philippines campaign strangled Japan's access to oil from Southeast Asia, dooming its navy to starvation. Samar was not merely a tactical defense. It was a hinge moment, closing the gates of Japanese power. Psychologically, the battle also revealed a deep shift in naval warfare. The Japanese had anchored their spirit in battleships, symbols of power and honor. The Americans had anchored theirs in carriers, tools of adaptability and reach. Samar proved beyond doubt that the age of the battleship was over. Yamato had fired her great guns, but she had accomplished nothing. Escort carriers, feeble in comparison, had dictated the outcome through speed, improvisation, and sheer coordination. Naval supremacy was no longer measured by caliber and armor, but by who could project power across distance, who could adapt, and who could coordinate. For Japanese sailors, this realization was devastating. Their empire had invested its soul in a weapon already obsolete. The human dimension was equally powerful. Survivors of Gamber Bay, Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts were plucked from the sea days later, their bodies burned and broken, but their spirits immortalized. They told stories of destroyers charging like wolves, of pilots launching with no ordnance, of carriers fleeing under walls of smoke while still launching planes. These stories traveled beyond the Pacific. They reached American homes, newspapers, and Congress, feeding a narrative of courage and ingenuity. For veterans, it was vindication that their sacrifices mattered. For future sailors, it was an unshakable standard on the Japanese side. Survivors whispered different tales. Crews aboard cruisers recalled being strafed endlessly by fighters they thought would never retreat. Captains confessed to being unnerved by torpedo runs that forced constant evasions. What unsettled them most was not the damage, but the audacity. They had expected Americans to scatter. Instead, they fought like madmen. Japanese sailors realized they had underestimated not just ships, but the spirit of an enemy who refused to die. That realization spread like a shadow through the Imperial Navy. Confidence faltered. If the Yamato herself could not bring victory, what hope remained? Strategically, Samar exposed the fatal flaw in Japanese doctrine: inflexibility. Kurita's fleet was powerful but brittle. When his formation scattered under smoke and torpedo attack, he lacked the communications and coordination to recover. His ships became individuals, not a single fist. The Americans, weak in hardware, compensated with cohesion. Escort carriers spoke tow destroyers and destroyers to aircraft, every move reinforcing the other. That difference in doctrine had long-term psychological effects. Japanese crews no longer believed their admirals' promises of decisive battle. Americans, in contrast, began to believe that even their weakest ships could shape victory. The impact also rippled forward into technology. Naval architects and strategists absorbed the lesson. Coordination outweighed caliber. Radios, radar, and logistics were more decisive than armor plate. Escort carriers became symbols of a new philosophy. War was no longer about singular giants, but about networks of weapons, each feeding into the whole. For the Japanese, this was a bitter pill. For the Americans, it was validation of a doctrine they would carry into the Cold War and beyond. But perhaps the deepest impact was emotional. Men who fought at Samar carried the scars forever. Survivors of the Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts remembered their captain's last words, their ships charging into oblivion. Carriers' crews recalled watching Gamber Bay slip beneath the waves, knowing she bought them time. On both sides, sailors felt the weight of what had transpired. For Americans, it was pride laced with grief. For Japanese, it was grief laced with shame. The humiliation of Samar broke more than a fleet. It broke the myth of Japanese naval invincibility, replacing it with doubt and despair. It also elevated the American escort carriers from ridicule to reverence, symbols of courage that transcended steel. Strategically, it safeguarded the Leyte landings and sealed Japan's fate. Psychologically, it reshaped how navies thought about power. And emotionally, it etched a truth into every sailor who survived: that in war, strength is not always measured in size, but in spirit. The Pacific never forgets. Beneath its restless waves lie the bones of ships and men, reminders that war is not only a contest of steel but also of ideas. When historians look back on the morning off Samar, they see more than a desperate fight. They see the death of an era, the undoing of centuries of naval tradition, and the birth of a philosophy that still defines warfare today. The escort carriers, mocked, underestimated, and derided as jeep carriers and Kaiser coffins, became the unlikely heralds of a new age. And the Japanese admirals who scorned them lived long enough to realize that their laughter had been silenced not by dreadnoughts, but by the very ships they dismissed as toys. In the immediate aftermath of Leyte Gulf, the strategic consequences were clear. Japan had gambled everything on Shogo 1 and lost. Their carrier force, used as a decoy, was annihilated at Cape Nganyo. Musashi lay at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea, her enormous bulk a monument to wasted ambition. Kurita's retreat at Samar meant the American landings at Leyte remained secure, opening the gateway to Luzon, Manila, and ultimately the home islands. From that day forward, the Imperial Navy ceased to be a strategic force. Yamato herself would make only one more sortie. In 1945, a desperate suicide run toward Okinawa, where she was sunk by waves of American aircraft before her guns could even reach shore. The dream of decisive battle, the Kamikaze, ended not with thunderous victory, but with ignominious retreat before a handful of escort carriers. The legacy was not just Japan's defeat, but also America's revelation. The battle proved that small, mass-produced carriers had a purpose far greater than their designers envisioned. Built to escort convoys and provide air cover for landings, they had accidentally demonstrated that numbers, coordination, and courage could humble giants. After the war, escort carriers continued to serve as training decks, aircraft transports, and helicopter platforms. Their lineage evolved into amphibious assault ships, the backbone of modern expeditionary warfare. The lesson endured. Flexibility and presence mattered more than sheer tonnage. The psychological legacy burned even brighter. The story of Taffy 3 spread through the U.S. Navy like gospel. The charge of Johnston, the duel of Samuel B. Roberts, and the last stand of Gambier Bay. These became touchstones of naval identity. In Annapolis classrooms, they were taught as case studies in courage. In veterans' halls, they were told with pride and grief. The phrase, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, entered the lexicon, a permanent reminder that valor can transcend design. For sailors boarding new ships in the Cold War, Samar was proof that the Navy's soul was not in its hardware, but in its crews. For the Japanese, the legacy was humiliation and regret. Survivors of Kurita's fleet spoke of confusion, of disbelief, and of shame at retreating before such weak opposition. Some defended Kurita, arguing that he preserved his fleet from annihilation. Others condemned him, insisting that Japan's last chance to alter the war had been squandered. In either case, the result was the same. The Imperial Navy never again mounted an operation of similar scale. When the Emperor announced surrender in August 1945, sailors who had once dreamed of glory aboard Yamato and Nagato stood idle. Their faith in battleships shattered, their pride broken. The escort carriers they once mocked had been their undoing. The broader legacy was doctrinal. The Second World War proved beyond doubt that the aircraft carrier had eclipsed the battleship as the capital ship of the sea. At Midway, fleet carriers had destroyed the Japanese offensive arm. At Samar, even escort carriers had repelled a battleship fleet. The contrast was stark. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, accomplished nothing. Casablanca-class carriers, the cheapest carriers ever built, secured a decisive victory. From then on, no navy in the world would build battleships as instruments of dominance. Aircraft carriers became the new queens of the sea, and their dominance continues to this day. The influence stretched beyond World War II. In Korea, carrier-based aircraft provided decisive support. In Vietnam, carriers anchored U.S. power in the South China Sea. In the Gulf War, they launched waves of precision strikes, embodying networked warfare that Samar had foreshadowed. In the 21st century, modern amphibious assault ships, bristling with helicopters and drones, trace their lineage back to those humble escort carriers. The lesson has endured through decades of technological change. War belongs not to the biggest guns, but to the most adaptable systems. Even on a personal level, the legacy of Samar has outlived its veterans. On the ocean floor, Gambier Bay, Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts rest as war graves, rediscovered by deep-sea explorers decades later. Their wrecks tell silent stories, twisted steel, shattered guns, and artifacts of men who fought against impossible odds. Divers who reach those depths speak of reverence, of standing in the presence of legends. For the families of the men who never returned, the story of Samar became a legacy of honor, proof that their sacrifice turned the tide of history. The irony remains sharp, even now. Japanese admirals once derided escort carriers as laughable, fragile, and unworthy of recognition. Yet it was those very ships that broke the back of their navy. Pride blinded them to reality, and reality punished them. The escort carriers became the embodiment of a truth modern militaries have learned again and again. Underestimating an enemy is fatal. Weapons do not win wars alone. Adaptability, coordination, and human will transform weakness into strength. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel of Germany reflected on his nation's defeat, he famously said, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that work together." In the Pacific, the sentiment was mirrored. Japan built better battleships, but America built ships that fought as one. Samar was the living proof. Yamato's guns may have shaken the ocean, but they could not shake the cohesion of escort carriers, destroyers, and aircraft fighting in unison. That was the lesson carved into the waves of October 1944. A lesson that resonates in every modern navy. As the final chapter of Samar is written, the closing image is not of Yamato's towering guns or Kurita's retreating fleet. It is of thin-skinned carriers plowing eastward under columns of smoke, still launching aircraft as shells erupted around them. It is of destroyers charging into certain death with torpedoes spent, firing until their decks vanished beneath the sea. It is of pilots diving empty-handed, forcing giants to flinch with nothing but courage. These images form the legacy that strength lies not in size, but in spirit. The sea remembers. History remembers. And the lesson of Samar stands eternal. In modern war, pride is a liability, speed defeats armor, and connection outweighs firepower. The escort carriers, once mocked as expendable, became immortal not through design, but through defiance. They did not simply survive. They rewrote the story of naval warfare. And in doing so, they left behind a truth as sharp as any shell. Never underestimate the small, for it may be the small that brings down empires.